it was like an NIE where find out. Please go ahead.
Go ahead. Autograph it, please.
Okay.
That's great.
Good morning, everyone. Robert Litvak, International Security Studies Program at the Wilson Center. Welcome to today's session, another in our ongoing series on terrorism and Homeland Security that the Center co-sponsors with Georgetown's Center for Peace and Security Studies and the Council on Global Terrorism. It's a special pleasure to welcome Dan Byman, who is the director of the of CPAS at Georgetown, to celebrate the publication of his new book, The Five-Front War, The Better Way to Fight Global Jihad. Let me turn the floor over to the co-chair of this series, Professor Bruce Hoffman of Georgetown, who will both tee up today's topic and introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Rob. Let me welcome you as well. Dan Byman is another one in the long series of speakers we have that really needs no introduction, not least because he's also my boss. But Dan began his career with the intelligence community. He subsequently went on to get a PhD at MIT. He then worked at the RAND Corporation for many years, where he was also the research director of RAND's Middle Eastern Studies Center. Dan subsequently went on to be a staff member in the Joint Senate and House Intelligence Committee's investigation of the 9/11 attacks. He followed that up by being a staff member on the 9/11 Commission, the commission chaired by Governor Tom Kean and Lee Hamilton. Congressman Lee Hamilton, of course, is the president of the Wilson Center. If you've read Philip Shannon's new book on the commission, The Uncensored History of the 9/11 Commission, you'll see that Dan doesn't feature prominently as one of the people he interviews, but it's interesting that in the acknowledgement, Philip Shannon cites Dan as, among others on the committee, as really the guiding intellectual lights of that effort. Dan is now director of Georgetown's Security Studies Program in the School of Foreign Service, and also an associate professor both in the school and in the Department of Government. He's simultaneously a senior fellow at the Saban Center at Brookings, and in addition to having written many books, his latest book, The Five-Front War, I was just telling him actually, I've seen so far in multiple bookstores in the United Kingdom, in Israel, and other places. It's, I think, a classic type of analysis of terrorism, of which there's unfortunately too few of these days. And we're delighted and pleased to have him here to discuss the book with us. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Rob, and thank you all very much for coming today. I'm going to try to keep this relatively casual, as we're a fairly small group. I wrote a book that my publisher is tearing his hair out about. It has problems on both the right and the left. It's not a book that says that the end is nigh and we're going to die within the next week. It's also not a book that says that the Bush administration is fundamentally evil and is leading our country to utter disaster from a counterterrorism point of view. What it tries to do is go through the current counterterrorism challenge. Look at different dimensions of it and look at various remedies or instruments used to fight terrorism and try to be fair about the relative strengths and the relative weaknesses. In my talk today, I want to begin, hopefully for only a few minutes, by discussing the adversary. A lot has changed since 9/11, and frankly, there's a lot that I feel we still don't understand particularly well, despite having this group be at center stage for over 6 years now. From a counterterrorism point of view, let me begin with a very basic question, which is, why is this organization so difficult to fight? One of the things you have to begin with is operational security. This is a group that pays tremendous attention by the standards of terrorism to operational security and the dangers of being penetrated. If you look at their materials that can be downloaded from the web, in addition to kind of exhortations to follow God and be a good Muslim, the vast majority of the material concerns operational security, describing how to compartment your operations, the techniques that police or security services use, and it shows the degree of professionalism this group has in contrast to so many other groups. A second difference about this group is that it's a group of leaders. That this is a group that, if you go back to their founding materials written 20 years ago, they talk about they want people who can play nice in the sandbox. And this is actually relatively unusual for many terrorist groups, which tend to attract outside egos, often very violent people who are not cooperative. But this is a group that has the ability to lose people and replace them in part because it's deliberately sought out leaders. One thing that's always worth doing if you're in this world is doing a Google search on Al-Qaeda's number 3. And the good news is, from a counterterrorism point of view, is we got him. You know, his name was Mohammed Atif. His name was Abu Zubaydah. His name was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And we can keep going. And there have been a list of very senior figures that the United States has either killed or arrested over the years. And for many groups, this would be utterly devastating. But this is an organization that has junior leaders who are trained to rapidly replace senior ones. Doesn't mean that there's no damage done, but an unusual group that has a very deep leadership cadre. It's also a group with a very, very popular agenda. If we were having this talk 10 years ago, I would say that this agenda has some legs, but right now the vast majority of people in the Muslim world who are active politically don't see the United States as a source of the region's problems. They might not like the United States, but they don't blame Washington first and foremost. I think 10 years later that the perception that Washington is the problem and the first problem is incredibly widespread. That many people look around, and whether it's Israel-Palestine or Iraq or Chechnya or Kashmir, there's a long list. People are pointing the finger first to Washington and saying that the problem begins there. So bin Laden's message that local groups should be putting aside their local agendas and concentrating on a more global foe has more credence to many ears. And in addition, he's been able to tap into a lot of these local grievances, whether against the Saudis or the Jordanians or so on. And the result is, in the Muslim world at least, this is an organization that is seen as standing for many causes that are seen as quite noble. Some people might disagree with its use of terrorism, some of its particular attacks, but the overall sense is that this is an organization that's on the right side of some of the big issues. One problem with this organization is it's difficult to say how big it is. I think I can sit before you today and say plausibly to you that the Al-Qaeda core, the group of people who have sworn loyalty to bin Laden personally, that today it numbers a couple hundred people. I think that's a reasonable statement, extremely small. I think I can also sit before you and say that this is an organization that has had tens of thousands of people that it has directly trained and it is able to tap into. I could also say that this is an organization that works with insurgencies around the Muslim world quite closely at times, and that these insurgencies number hundreds of thousands of people. And I can also say that this is an ideology that inspires people around the world to violence, to anti-Americanism, to oppose their governments. And here we're talking, in terms of people who accept some tenet of the ideology, millions of people. So when you talk about fighting Al-Qaeda or fighting Sunni extremism, you have to be very careful because there are so many different dimensions of the adversary in this, and the result is the size is very confusing. Two other things are worth pointing out that have changed dramatically since 9/11. One of the biggest is Iraq. If we go back to January 2003, 5 years ago, this was an organization that was hit extremely hard. It had been rousted from the haven in Afghanistan. Globally, its network was under siege from security services around the world. And also, as an idea, it had been discredited to a degree. That many people looked at it and said, this is within the broader Islamist community, it said, look, there was an Islamic state, and it was called the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. And you woke up the United States, which kind of in a quick backhand got rid of this entire government. And if you really care about the ultimate goal, which is building an Islamic society and an Islamic state, you did the opposite of what you should be doing. And tremendous criticism of the organization. Iraq really reinvigorated it. A lot of operational benefits of young men going to fight, where they network, learn new skills. But the big thing was really inspiration, where not only did this enrage the Muslim world, but it vindicated bin Laden's narrative. When he said the United States is at the root of the problem, many people said, that's just not true. The government of Egypt is the problem, the government of Saudi Arabia. But here's the United States invading a large, powerful Muslim country and really vindicating the view that the United States is trying to keep the Muslim world down. And in particular, it validated bin Laden among the broader Salafi community, the broader community of Muslims who has quite puritanical views of Islam. Most traditional Salafis are exceptionally hostile to the jihadists like bin Laden. Their view is that this is someone who, when a Christian beats up a Muslim in the Philippines, this guy screams jihad, and that's just silly, frankly. They said, and many traditional scholars said this, jihad can only be declared by certain types of scholars under very unusual circumstances, such as when a large Christian army invades and occupies a Muslim land, which happened. And so, again, this restored credibility of this group. One thing that, frankly, I'm still wrestling with the consequences of myself is that Al-Qaeda has suffered huge blows. Al-Qaeda of Iraq has suffered huge blows in the last 14, 15 months. And I spent a lot of time trying to look at the implications of disaster in Iraq for the broader war on terrorism. It's hard to say Iraq is a success right now. But on the other hand, the organization has been hit quite hard. And this has, for the most part, positive implications beyond Iraq. And so it's worth thinking of Iraq largely still in the negative column, but there is a silver lining to what was a very cloudy sky. But to go back to darkness for a bit, the other quite painful development has been the development of a haven in Pakistan, where this began really shortly after 9/11, where Al-Qaeda was allowed to regroup in tribal areas. And over the years, in part due to incapacity, but also in part due to a lack of a total effort, this organization has really taken root, and parts of Pakistan have become ungoverned. Other parts that were relatively peaceful are now in semi-revolt. And as a result, the advantages the organization was able to enjoy in Afghanistan before 9/11, some of them are accruing in Pakistan today, where they can train larger numbers of people, they can plan, they have a degree of mental rest. The way I tend to describe this is, if you think of Al-Qaeda before 9/11 on September 10th, 2001, let's say on the terrorism scale it was a 10. If we go to 2003, I would put it at probably a 3. Today I would put it at about a 6. So I don't want to say Al-Qaeda is back in the same way as it was before 9/11, but the motion, the trend line is extremely disturbing. Before I go on to counterterrorism, let me point out a few divisions within the adversary that I think are important and worth talking about. One is there's a tremendous dispute within the broader jihadist movement over who is the adversary. There's a big, kind of a tempest in a teapot among counterterrorism analysts in the United States over, is this organization about values or is it about policy? And most terrorism analysts tend to point to statements by bin Laden or his number 2, which are really focused on U.S. policies in the Middle East. But when you go farther down the food chain, when you look at the ideology in general, who they're trying to recruit, values count more and more. And as a result, you have some groups or some individuals that are quite concerned about things like cartoons mocking the Prophet Muhammad in Denmark, while others are concerned about more traditional views such as the U.S. occupation of Iraq. In addition, you have different priorities. We have training materials from various Al-Qaeda camps, and some will talk about, the really important enemy is Israel, and others will talk about the United States, others will talk about corrupt regimes. Today you'd have to add the Shia to that as well. And as a result, this movement has a possibility, at least, of going in very different directions. Add to that another division, which is hostility towards political Islam. There's a lot of conflation in the United States of the Muslim Brotherhood, which can be very anti-American, with the jihadist movement, when in fact the blood between the two is exceptionally bitter. You have the Muslim Brotherhood, which, for the most part, in most countries, has embraced the idea of political participation and is quite hostile to the jihadist movement. And some of Zawahiri's biggest writings have been attacking the Muslim Brotherhood for betraying principles, for cooperating with the political system. And it's the political Islamists who are strongest in the Middle East, not the jihadists. So this is a very big enemy to make. I mentioned the division between jihadists and Salafis, and that's still there. Many Salafis are skeptical of political participation at all. and see the jihadists and their embrace of violence as entering the political world. Their view is once you do that, you become corrupt almost by nature. A fourth division is nationalism. This is a movement that has tried to transcend differences between Egyptians and Pakistanis and Indonesians, and actually has enjoyed quite a fair degree of success on that. My amateur historian's take on the 20th century is that if you had to draw one lesson from the 20th century, it would be don't mess with nationalism. It's this incredibly powerful, dangerous force. And my belief is that over time the national divisions, some of which we've already seen, may increase in this organization. The last thing I'll note is the dispute over who is kuffar, who is, they use the term, many people who criticize this organization use the term takfiris, that this is an organization that is regularly going around to other Muslims and saying they're not good Muslims, they're apostates because they're not with us. And it's a question that any ideological organization has to confront, which is where is the line between being a member and being outside it? And one thing that's relatively unusual about bin Laden is he himself has been willing to work and cooperate with quite secular groups as well as different political Islamist groups. But many people within his organization are exceptionally hostile to even slight deviations from what they feel is the pure jihadist movement. So there's a tremendous potential for a bloodbath, and we've seen this happen in the jihadist movement in the past. Probably the most painful example was Algeria in the mid-1990s, where the jihadist insurgency there really ran off the rails and just began consuming Algerian society, where its primary enemy for a time became other Muslims who were not fighting in the jihad, and the government assumed secondary importance. Now, with all these weaknesses and with all these strengths, this is where U.S. counterterrorism comes in. And my book talks about the different dimensions of the response, and it's actually a misleading title. It began as the Sixth Front War, but in the name of alliteration, I knocked a front off. And I think ironically, the front that kept its own chapter but came out of the title was diplomacy, which may say something about the world today. But it's I will, in my talk at least, go back to six fronts where I talk about in the book intelligence, the military, diplomacy, Homeland Security, ideas, and political reform. The obvious point, but one worth making, is that all these different dimensions have to play into the overall U.S. response. I think former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld had a point, which is we need to think about are we killing them faster than we're creating new ones? And his answer seemed to be at the time, no, we're not. And I would say that to a degree that's still true today. I'm not going to drag you through every single one of these aspects of counterterrorism today. I'm going to focus on a few different ones, and we can talk about others in Q&A. Let me start at the military, which is one that tends to get the most attention and is, I would say, our general public perception of counterterrorism is that we've over-militarized the response. We have a heavy reliance on the military. And you still look at kind of rhetoric of the political candidates. And the sign of whether you're tough or not on terrorism seems to be how much you want the military to be involved. There are some very good and appropriate uses of the military in counterterrorism. One that I think is personally quite important is targeted killing. At times, you're not able to arrest terrorist leaders. And when you can't do so, you have to kill them. And that's an exceptionally difficult thing to do at times. It requires superb intelligence. Requires often capabilities in terms of having platforms in the air, spotters on the ground, things that often the United States is going to lack. But even so, it's quite important. In general, to be clear, target killing doesn't really work as a deterrent. These are the people we're killing are living an exceptionally dangerous life day to day. And the added chance of dying from a Predator, a Hellfire missile, is not going to change their odds too much. But it does affect capabilities. When groups have to train new leaders, when they have to spend a lot of time in hiding or worrying about being killed, it imposes operational costs on the group. I've mentioned that al-Qaeda has a very deep bench. So I don't think that killing a leader here and there is going to make a tremendous impact. But it will make some. And the faster you can do the pace, the more impact it's going to have. The caveat to all this, though, is that errors in targeted killing are exceptionally risky. From a U.S. point of view, at some point when we miss, at some point, in fact, when we hit someone, we may kill large numbers of innocents. And the PR disaster from that is probably bigger than any operational gain we have. So I think it's right to be relatively cautious on this when we're doing targeting and to often not take shots. To go back to a lot of the examples people use, some people have mentioned that the United States before 9/11 had about 10 reports of where bin Laden was and didn't take shots. It's worth pointing out that the vast majority of those reports, he wasn't actually there. That we had the report, but the report was wrong or it was outdated. So if we had taken the shot, we would have missed and killed innocent people. But a couple of them were right. And that's the trade-off we have to think about is not just killing innocents because it's morally wrong, and as a superpower I think we have a special responsibility in this regard, but also because it makes us look cruel, it makes us look harsh, and it alienates some of the very people we want to win over. A second use of the military is counterinsurgency. We tend to think of counterinsurgency as Iraq, to a degree as Afghanistan, but the biggest role in counterinsurgency is largely training allied forces. That this is a very traditional role of special operations forces, where your real goal is to use limited numbers of U.S. forces as a force multiplier to try to enhance the capabilities of locals. Counterinsurgency is almost always done best by local forces rather than U.S. forces. But because al-Qaeda taps into these insurgencies, this is going to be something we'll be doing even if we got out of Iraq and Afghanistan tomorrow. A third thing is we need the potential for regime change, even if it's a card that we don't use very often. We don't want a new Taliban. We don't want an openly hostile anti-U.S. regime out there supporting this movement. And we need the capacity to topple it, even if it's something that is unlikely to happen in terms of a regime doing this, but we need this on the table. That said, we often tend to use the military for limited retaliatory strikes, which is something we should not do. In general, this is what a former colleague of mine used to call TLAM therapy, where it does kind of feel good to launch a few cruise missiles at something and blow it up. You feel the sense of kind of catharsis almost, that you're finally responding. But it doesn't fail, but it usually is worse. It usually backfires. It allows the terrorists to increase recruiting. It makes them look like they're standing up to the United States. And it does very little damage. It's hard to destroy terrorist sites. It's hard to hit significant numbers of cadre. So, what to do in the military? I mentioned the emphasis on the traditional soft mission, which I would prioritize over the door kicker mission. A couple things to think about. One is that if you're building up local capacity, whether through special operation forces, you should also be thinking about the police. This is something that my colleague Bruce Hoffman has done a lot of work on. But a lot of times the goal is to stop the insurgency well before it gets rolling. And here police tend to be much more important than the military. Unfortunately, we don't have a bureaucracy that has embraced a police training mission. There's some in Treasury, there's some in State, there's some in DOD, there's some in CIA. But none of these bureaucracies like to train police. And it often falls on the military. And what the military likes to do is essentially train the police as cheap light infantry, giving them a function similar to light infantry as opposed to recognizing the priority of the law and order mission. In my view, we're back to the days of foreign internal defense. This is a 1950s and 1960s concept where we're really trying to build local capacity against subversion and against insurgency. And I'd like to see us have a bureaucracy taking on the mission. Okay. Homeland Security. We could spend a lot of time here kind of pointing out the shortfalls of the Department of Homeland Security. And I don't really want to do that. They're fairly well known, and frankly, they're fairly well known within the Department of Homeland Security. So having yet another outsider point that out isn't of greatest use. But we have some bigger problems, and they fall in the realm of strategy. Most of our Homeland Security effort is, I play a little game in my class on terrorism, which is in the beginning of the class we play the wouldn't it suck game, which is you kind of go through, here's the sorts of attacks that terrorists could do, why don't they do it, oh my God, we're all going to die. And it's very compelling, but over time you realize that the inner logic that terrorists have is quite different than simply trying to map our vulnerabilities. An example I like to use is port and container security, where we spend a tremendous amount of effort that's going to grow on port and container security, when I've seen almost no serious indication that a terrorist group wants to go after a U.S. port, and that this is a major priority for most terrorist groups. In a perfect world, would we have better security? Sure. But I would spend the money on about 500 other things before I spent it on that. The result is we shovel a lot of money at the problem, and there's a lot of financial costs, and there are also costs in terms of goodwill. It's very hard for leaders and elites of Muslim countries to come to the United States without hassle, so many of them don't. It's harder for students to study here, and we don't have a good sense of metrics. We don't really know if it's working or not. A key question is, why hasn't there been an attack at home? And to put my my cards on the table, on September 12, 2001, I was asked, would we be hit again? And I said yes. And by now I'm wrong. Even if the attack comes tomorrow, I was still wrong on that. So I've been spending a lot of time trying to think about why that hasn't happened. I'm not convinced it has much to do with U.S. defenses, although there may be a perception among al-Qaeda that our defenses are better than at least I think they are. I think it's a combination of two factors. One is that we've hit the network very hard overseas, and as a result, it's harder for them to do long-term operations because we might get the al-Qaeda number 3. And if they're hiding in Pakistan and they're hiding other places, it's harder for them to kind of openly do the long-term planning they need to do, something comparable to the embassy operations or even 9/11. That said, that strength of ours is diminishing because of the gains the organization has made in Pakistan. The other advantage is that there's not a serious logistics network in the United States. If you look at most of the places where there have been attacks, in Europe in particular, this organization has been able to draw on local Muslims in a whole variety of ways. In the United States, there's a huge advantage, which is a very well integrated, supportive Muslim population. And if you look at who the FBI has arrested, the Department of Justice has arrested, these are basically almost entirely chuckleheads. I mean, these are people who have very, very limited operational skills. Now, this doesn't mean that one of these people can't pick up a gun, an automatic weapon, go to a mall and shoot 50 people. So just to be unskilled doesn't mean you can't be deadly. But it does mean that certain types of attacks are much, much harder. And when you compare this with the community that they're drawing from, which has given large numbers of tips to the FBI, local police, there's a real disparity there. It means that it's harder for the organization to kind of burrow in. So what to do in Homeland Defense? A couple things. One is, when you're thinking about targets and what to defend, think about targets that resonate overseas. So obviously, the White House being a huge example, but are there other examples of a target that might be known to audiences around the world? Symbolic is even more important than the type of damage being done. A key question to ask is, what are we not defending? And I hope the answer is, this is going to sound odd to you, I hope the answer is quite a bit. Because we can't defend everything. And when you get beyond a certain point, spending a lot of money on defenses means that you're not gaining much for your buck. That if you defend one restaurant, you defend one movie theater, they can move on to the next. My view is there should be a pretty firm line drawn at high-value targets, whether because they're inherently dangerous, a nuclear power plant, or of high symbolic value. But beyond that, the defenses that are used for crime, the defenses that are used on kind of a day-to-day level should suffice. But with that comes, there will be some attacks. It does mean that something that wasn't defended, that could have been notionally, may be attacked. Which gets to a third point, which is the need to build up domestic resilience. Terrorism is, as everyone knows, a psychological tool. The example I use is something like the anthrax attacks, which killed 5 people, but really shut down parts of the country. Had a huge disproportionate impact, and it's tragic that 5 people died in such a horrible way. But this is 5 deaths is not catastrophic for a nation. Yet we responded that way. And I think leaders, and this is to be clear, leaders on both sides of the political aisle, spend a lot of time kind of building up fear rather than trying to diminish it. And this sort of casually told needs to be put in perspective, because otherwise we're going to overreact, we're going to waste money, and we're going to put lives in danger where we don't need to. Right now, I don't really think we have a communication strategy. An example I would use is, let's suppose that there is a major terrorist attack on the New York subway tomorrow. Who do we listen to? Do we listen to the people running the subway in New York? Do we listen to the city police? Do we listen to the FBI field office, the JTTF? Do we listen to national authorities? My guess is that every single one of those people is going to be talking, but they're not going to have one message. And that confusion is going to alarm people far more than the actual attack. A couple things to think about as we're going forward. One is that the FBI has made huge changes since 9/11. And you can argue that the Director Mueller has really almost heroically tried to transform the organization from emphasizing law enforcement to emphasizing intelligence and prevention. There is still an open question to me of can this be done? And I would like to see serious work done on what a domestic intelligence service that's a distinct institution would look like in the United States, what its legal powers would be, what its capabilities would be, where would it be housed, would it be independent, and so on. My concern is that if there were another significant attack on the United States, we might create a domestic intelligence service overnight. And that would be about the worst way to create one. And we want something serious off the board. I look at the USA Patriot Act, which has some good things in my opinion, some bad things. But it was created overnight. And when you do that, that's almost bound to have problems in the legislation. And so to me, I would like someone to be able to take something off the shelf and say, here it is. Here's what a domestic intelligence service should look like. Now's the time. But anything we do has to be vetted against the possibility of losing Muslim support at home. That this is a huge strategic asset of the United States, and any tactical gain we might have from a particular wiretap, a particular operation, fingerprinting someone, has to be measured against ensuring the loyalty of this community. A third thing I'll talk about is political reform. The Bush administration has embraced democratization as a counterterrorism instrument. And in a way, it is a kind of more satisfying strategic vision than some of the alternatives, because the alternative is usually you just kind of deal with this problem incessantly, and you hope it's either at a relatively small level or that it goes away on its own, which isn't the answer I like to present, but it ends up being where I am, but it's not one I'm very happy with or comfortable with. And there's no question that in the Muslim world and in the Arab world in particular, these are some of the worst governments in the world. There's a huge democratic deficit, huge problems with human rights. And democracy in general has many advantages for economic growth and for the people of these countries. But that's different from saying it's good for counterterrorism. And to me, I think there are some real problems with using democracy for counterterrorism. But the arguments for are rather intuitive. I think if you got most of the people in this room over a beer at, in the wee hours, I think we might say, if I were an 18-year-old Egyptian male, I'd be tempted to join a violent opposition group as well. What hope have you through peaceful opposition? When you do it, you get beaten up. You have no resources. The government is becoming more and more autocratic. In Egypt, one of the world's great, Arab republics, it looks like it's becoming a hereditary monarchy. What hope have you? So you need dramatic change. Sometimes peaceful change doesn't work. But when you think of it from a counterterrorism point of view, the benefits really are uncertain. Right now, a lot of the injustice that people are fighting about, the issues people are fighting about, are more global. So there are people in Egypt who are concerned about the oppression of the Mubarak regime. But many who are opposed to the United States are concerned about U.S. support for Israel or Iraq or other issues. So the grievance often isn't local, and it's more true than any time before. It's a point many people make that the hardcore of the jihadists themselves won't be terribly affected by this, that they've always been very anti-democratic. The real impact, though, is presumably on potential supporters, which would be more willing to provide intelligence on the radicals, and it would decrease recruitment funding. But the big problem is that there's a transitional cost. I think if we could be sure that Egypt would become a democracy, it'd be worth doing. But even under the most optimistic scenarios, we're talking decades. And in those decades, the transition is dangerous. You're weakening a government. And if you're doing it right, the thing you're weakening most is the security service, which is the very instrument used to fight terrorism on a day-to-day basis. And in the process of democratization, you have new grievances that come up, that all of a sudden there's political space and openness that people can express what angers them. And with that comes a degree of instability. Any government that would win a free and fair election in the Arab world would be much more anti-American than current U.S. allies, just because the United States is so exceptionally unpopular. in the Arab world. That'd be harder to have more open cooperation. In every country in the Arab world, we've seen that the freer the election, the better the Islamists do. So in Lebanon or Iraq, Gaza, where you had relatively free elections, the Islamists did quite well. And even Saudi Arabia and Egypt, when the door was open about this much, the Islamists came in as much as they could. And there are reasons to think the Islamists might be more gentle in power than they were in opposition, but they're certainly not going to be pro-American. I think that's relatively straightforward. And the last point is pretty obvious, but worth pointing out. We don't really have a sense of how to promote democracy in highly autocratic societies. I'm a political scientist by training, and I think if I had a colleague next to me who was an economist, he or she could say, I can tell you how to take a command economy and turn it into a market economy. It's going to be tough, it's going to be miserable, but do these 20 steps and you'll get there. I can't do that on democracy. There are too much we don't know, too many factors we don't understand that come into play here. All that said, there are times when we should support it. And my view is when democracy is moving on its own, organically, we should be on the bandwagon. So Lebanon, I would say the Palestinian areas, we should be pushing democracy because they're moving on their own. Indonesia is certainly a surprising and happy success in my view. But where democracy is not moving, the real goal should be to develop institutions and to try to lay the conditions so that if it does occur on its own, it'll more likely succeed. The great question to me is Pakistan today. And if I were talking 3-4 years ago, I would have said we shouldn't be aggressively pushing democracy in Pakistan, that there's a dictator who's an ally, we should be working with him. I think that's increasingly wrong. Part of it is that Pakistan has a genuine democratic movement. The secular parties are quite corrupt, certainly unpleasant, but they're real. They have real constituencies. Add to that, the benefits of dictatorship are diminishing. The number of high-level arrests, the ability to keep the country under control, all that's much worse than it was 3 years ago. And so to me, if we're getting fewer rewards, it might be time to switch sides on this. Let me close by going in a completely different direction and talking about policy resilience. A lot of what we do in counterterrorism is, if not exactly new, the scale is relatively new. So, target killings, renditions, expanded wiretapping authority for domestic wiretaps, new legal codes for trying suspected terrorists, coercive interrogation methods. All these fall in the gray area between national security and the rule of law. And I'm guessing around this room we have quite different opinions on some of these. I can't tell you who's going to be the president in 2008. I have no idea. I'm not going to tell you who's going to be the president in 2025. But I think I can tell you that in the next 25 years, we're going to have a relatively liberal president and a relatively conservative one. And we want policies that can endure across administrations. There are huge transition costs domestically when you have to do things differently every 4 or every 8 years. Bureaucratically, people are very reluctant to go forward if they're afraid they're going to be hung out to dry. An example I would use is CIA people right now are justifiably concerned that after being told to have policies that involve waterboarding, that they're now going to be prosecuted for doing those policies. You don't want that whipsawing back and forth. It doesn't allow you to build knowledge, to build that expertise. And so I would urge both a degree of caution on designing policies, but also a high degree of debate. I think only recently have we begun to debate things like renditions or coercive interrogations, and these debates aren't pleasant. And if I were in the executive branch, I would always want that debate to happen some other time because it's going to suck attention and it's going to make it harder to get anything done. But you need some degree of consensus on the basic policies if they're going to be sustained. And right now, that's my biggest concern, is not the policies per se, but institutionalizing them in the years to come. I'll stop there, and I'd welcome your questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan. You've certainly given us a lot to think about and a lot of very sensible suggestions. Questions from the floor? Yes, so can you please state your name and your affiliation?
Yeah, Aaron Miller, I'm with the Woodrow Wilson Center. Humor me for 30 seconds. The organizing premise of any nation's foreign policy is the protection of the homeland. If you can't protect your homeland, you don't need a foreign policy. Now, we sit here with with a degree of physical security and isolation unprecedented in history. We've got non-predatory neighbors to our north and south, and we have fish, literally, to our east and west. We are more secure than any great power has ever been. So I want to ask you the one question which you have not addressed. In your view, what is the most acute threat to the continental security of the United States? And how likely, in your judgment, is that threat to materialize in I don't know what the near future is, but how likely is it to materialize? Without prejudging, I mean, I have my own answer to that question, but because you haven't addressed that specific issue. We haven't been attacked in 6 years. There are many reasons for that, I'm sure. But if you had to identify the urgency of this issue, how would you do it?
It's a great question, and this is part of the challenge. Let me talk at you for a bit without answering the question to give you some context on my views. First question to think about is, what is an acceptable level of risk? So is 10 people dying from a terrorist attack, is that a threat to our homeland security? It's tragic, it's horrible, it's the duty of government to try like hell to stop that. But, it's not 9/11. Where is the line between acceptable and unacceptable? I would say that within the next 5 years, it's quite plausible there would be a Madrid or London style attack on the United States. The DC Metro, which I regularly take, would be an obvious target. That's quite plausible to me. Would I say likely? No, but would I say above 20%? Certainly. So certainly something worth preparing for, given that most uses of violence, of political violence, are exceptionally rare in general. So I would say that scale of attack is quite plausible. I would put the catastrophic lower. I think that it's less likely to have sustained campaigns in the United States. If you define Homeland Security as Americans rather than American soil, I certainly think that there are likely to be attacks on American assets overseas as well. So I put all these in the plausible with a couple caveats. One is that in a kind of a grand historic perspective, I think the overall security environment for the United States is rather benign in terms of things that we traditionally worry about. War between the great powers, nuclear conflict. I mean, these are things that you never say never, but don't look terribly likely for the foreseeable future. Even the scare scenarios people make about China, to me, in the near term at least, highly unlikely. So the joy is the United States has the luxury of being able to focus on some things that don't kill as many people. The other problem with terrorism is an agency problem, which is that if you don't defend against it, you have a risk that it snowballs or escalates. But all this said, it comes down to what degree of risk you're comfortable with as a citizen. If you're okay with the idea, not okay with that's impolite, but if you're willing to say that I understand that there is a plausible chance of several low-level terrorist attacks in the next 10 years, and I'd rather spend my money and government effort elsewhere. Okay. Most Americans are not. And to me, that's actually a legitimate political question. That's something that voters, to me, have a right to decide, which is, do they care much more about this particular way of dying, this particular threat to governance, this particular issue than others? Because I do feel that the threat is there. I just don't feel it's overwhelming.
Yes, sir.
Got a microphone coming, Chinch.
Okay. I'm Chinch Woolerton with the Nuclear Energy Institute, and I'm not going to ask a nuclear question. We think that's pretty secure at our nuclear plants, but I'm really intrigued in looking at your 5 fronts. I would have enjoyed the 6th front, but I want to focus on the 5th front, because in this country, probably the preeminent idea is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if you go through the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, you don't see that word democracy. And personally, after the Federalist Papers taking an amateur approach, I'm not sure we are one, and I'm wondering why we want to export something like democracy when it conflicts with Sharia and Ulema and all of the concepts that are in the Muslim world Are we making a mistake there? It's probably the only thing that bothers me personally about what we've done, because even though there have been a lot of mistakes, I think the administration has had to do what they've had to do in your 5 or 6 front war. But that democracy business seems to be at the heart of the modernity type concept. And if you look at Karen Armstrong's fleet of books, it confuses the issue when you talk about democracy. And would you just address that concept? Because you mentioned something earlier. You said political reform. You didn't say democratic reform. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you make a difference here. I'm sorry about the long-winded question, but it seems to me to be something we don't discuss very much at all.
That's an important question. This is something, in my opinion, I agree with part of what you've said and disagree with other parts. In the Muslim world, democracy has several promising examples, Indonesia being quite a good one, Turkey being another one, and these aren't perfect democracies. But in my opinion, these are real democracies. People enjoy some rights, but certainly more than they used to. And there is a degree of popular participation, and the things we look at for measures of democracy are there to some degree. The real problem in the democratic deficit is in the Arab world, which is, therefore, to me, it's really not about Islam per se, because there are Muslim countries that have this, that have some degree of democracy. And I generally don't see the religion argument being overwhelming, in that most religions have an incredible tradition on which to draw that can justify a lot of very different things. Christianity historically was used to justify slavery. It was used to justify liberation from slavery. It was used to justify the divine right of kings. Yet we talk about, George Bush talks about freedom being God's gift to humanity, and he would say that as a devout Christian, I think he believes it, and I believe him when he says he believes that. So to me, just as Christianity can encompass a very wide range of political concepts, so too can Islam. And so to me, there's the idea of consultation. If you look at some of the early Islamic teachings and practices, there was a lot of kind of back and forth on this. So to me, it's quite plausible. The tricky issue in the Arab world, though, is about women. Because if you look at, right now at least, the last poll I saw, if the question of do you think democracy is the best form of government, the Arab world scores higher than any region of the world. And I think it's because they've experienced tyranny more than any region of the world, where ironically higher than the United States or Western Europe. I think there's a degree of political correctness in the United States and Western Europe where we say, well, best, what would that mean? Well, we're just good like every other form. But very strong support for democracy. But there's not strong support for women's equality. And that's a huge difference between the United States, its Western allies, and the Arab world. And there we tend to encounter a lot more resistance. I think the big problem with exporting democracy is, one is there are conditions that make it more likely to succeed and less likely to succeed. And the other is, I don't think people like foreigners pushing ideas on them too hard. And so to me it's more kind of, xenophobia is the wrong word, but if the French came down to where I live in Maryland and came with a bunch of troops and says, hey, we're going to expand health care for poor people, which I believe in, I might just instinctively oppose it, because I don't like someone else from another country telling me what to do. And I have one of my best students just came back from Iraq, and he had his third tour there, and he had been in Anbar, kind of seen it go from bad to good. And I said, why do you think all this started? We have so many different explanations. He said, hey, if the Russians invade Canada, which side are you on? He said it's really just that simple, where just initially people are very hostile to foreigners kind of coming in. So I think that's been our bigger problem, rather than a specific, difference in civilizations or religions.
Sam? Oh, no. Oh, Sam Wells. Thanks. We'll come to you.
Sam Wells here at the Center, Dan. You placed a lot of emphasis on institutionalizing the policies. And one of the things that makes it difficult for politicians to deal with this is the politics of fear. You also said that people of both parties have used fear. I would differ with that a good bit. I think this is pretty much a preserve of the Republican Party. And I don't remember many Democrats who really emphasized the fear dimension. But it's there. It gives a multiplier effect to any sort of terrorism that comes along. So the question is, how can you have even-handed policies and continuity when it is anticipated by every Democratic leader, if they try and modulate a policy, they're going to be called weak on terrorism, weak on national security, and they're going to be hammered over the head.
One of the joys of having a microphone in front of me is I can claim expertise on a particular issue, even if it's not true. And I certainly don't claim expertise on U.S. politics and messaging. So let me give kind of one citizen's opinion here. To go back to your point about, is it really just the Republicans beating this drum? On Homeland Security, the Democrats have been beating it pretty heavily. Where they've been, as far as I could tell, especially in the first Bush administration, their goal in Homeland Security was to make a little noise and do as little as possible about it. They opposed the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. In general, they opposed most funding initiatives and so on. And the Democrats were the ones doing things like, right now there could be a nuclear weapon being smuggled in our ports, that sort of thing. So I think kind of on the overseas angle, it's been more Republican, but on the Homeland Security issue, a bit more Democratic. Certainly, a Democrat is going to be heavily attacked. I mean, what, to be honest, was rather stunning to me was to see, John Kerry, who was a legitimate war hero, being attacked on national security grounds, and presumably that if it were Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, which don't have the distinguished military record, they would be vulnerable. A couple things. One, unfortunately for sales of my book, terrorism is less prominent an issue than it was 4 years ago. Doesn't mean it's not prominent, but there are other issues in play. So that's, I think, it'll be harder to get the response you want as a politician by beating this. The other is that politicians can be very good at doing highly symbolic efforts that don't actually have that much impact. And so you can announce major initiatives that you put literally thousands of dollars behind, and we've done this historically. Both parties have been able to do this when in power, which is embrace an issue and kind of kill it through an embrace. That's perhaps a realistic best hope. Whenever anyone, an analyst like myself or someone else, says that we need leadership to change X or Y or Z, I get very nervous because I tend to believe in institutions rather than leaders. And yes, it would be wonderful to have, Abraham Lincoln and Harry Truman as our presidents again and again. But realistically, we're going to get more ordinary mortals who follow polls, who take advantage of political opportunities, who seize on weaknesses for short-term gain. And so my hope is that between the issue going out of the headlines a bit and also politicians' ability to kind of make something of nothing, that there might be some hope. But it's a real problem.
Sir, and then we'll...
My name is Stephen Shore. I'm with the PBGC. A question: suppose in the continued absence of a attack on the in the United States, would you expect the more visible signs of security, public support for the more visible signs of security to start to erode? For example, I agree with you that the D.C. Metro would be in theory a prime target, but I'm more annoyed at the same public announcement over and over again is that your bag. This is to me a far greater irritant than the conceptual risk of an explosion in the D.C. Metro.
Yes, I certainly think it would erode, although I was listening to the radio coming in this morning and I was hearing that Amtrak is changing its policies to have inspections done of bags and so on a kind of a spot basis, so it won't be sustained, but nevertheless a sign that some of the institutionalization, which takes years in the United States, is coming into play and is likely to continue to do so. What will tend to happen to me is a lot of the programs designed for counterterrorism will still be justified along those lines, but will really be about other things. That can be good and that can be bad. It's often very bad to have a policy designed for one thing be used for another purpose. But, when I was in California talking to some folks in the DHS field offices there, they would say, look, our goal is, counterterrorism is our number one priority. Check. And we talk and say, well, what do you do? Well, we've arrested or detained, something like, 100,000 people at the border. I mean, some staggering number. Well, any of them involved in terrorism? Well, no, but, and they seem to be more than happy to take counterterrorism money, do PowerPoint slides that put counterterrorism at the top of their mission, and then do whatever the heck it is they do. That can be very dangerous, though, if you actually want to change institutions. And that's my big concern about the FBI, is the institutional culture is so strong there that I worry that their efforts to transform themselves into a more sustained domestic intelligence organization will be difficult. And having kind of talked about Homeland Security spending not being that effective, I would say spending on intelligence tends to be exceptionally effective, especially when you're talking about domestic intelligence. By the standards of most programs, it's relatively low cost. And it is something that will give you a sense of, I said to the gentleman earlier, I think the threat out there is real but not overwhelming. I could be wrong. And in any event, my judgment today is going to be different 5 years from now. But to make that judgment informed, I need as much information as I can. And so to me, the spending on, we call it domestic intelligence, which is scaring, but, information sharing at all levels of government, or some euphemism, I think would be an appropriate investment.
Sir, and then we'll come to this side of the room.
Thank you very much. My name is Chingiz Mamadov. I am fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I am originally from Azerbaijan. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really very useful, and I think I agreed with almost everything that you've said. But I would like to make kind of a couple of points. I think you rightly mentioned that two things, and you mentioned all three things, which kind of contribute to kind of negative impression in the Muslim world. I am from Muslim country. Azerbaijan is a Muslim country towards the United States, like deadlock in the Middle East, then Iraq, and third you mentioned that kind of lack of democracy in these countries. I don't know whether right or wrong, but perception in countries, including my country, among people who want kind of democracy, is that United States not only tolerates kind of undemocratic regimes, but supports them. I'm saying that for right or wrong, but this is a perception. And I think, in general, United States and, say, Western democracies face a dilemma right now. As you rightly mentioned it, there is kind of transitional cost for democracy, because if country is not ready for democracy and you try to kind of promote democracy, then there is danger that, this country will go kind of, so autocracy seems more plausible than, kind of lack of democracy. And I think now this slogan by Kennedy is very kind of, Barack Obama made that there is no fear than fear itself. I think it's right. There is kind of need for taking risk. For example, and I think that too many kind of countries are stereotyped, to say Muslim countries, Arab countries, but countries differ from each other. And I made research in 2004-2005 at the National Endowment for Democracy. I analyzed Azerbaijan, and I know that Azerbaijan was very close to democracy, believe me, in the period from 2000 to 2003, 2004. But for both domestic mistakes, oppositional mistakes, and international community mistakes, Azerbaijan kind of was sliding, far from democracy during the last 8-9 years. And I think this individual approach to each country, plus, entry points. Certain countries should be selected, picked up, which are closer to democracy. And especially countries like Azerbaijan, it's not as big as Pakistan, it's not as big as others, I am absolutely sure that if efforts, for example, which were made in Georgia, at least 1/5 of it would be contributed to Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan today would be a democracy and showcase for other Muslim countries to show. And Azerbaijan is a country which in 1918, almost 100 years ago, first established a democratic republic which was successful. So we have legacy of democracy. We have political parties which trace their roots, back 100 years ago. So I agree with everything that you've said, but I think that with one caveat that there are opportunities to promote democracy in Muslim countries, but unfortunately not enough efforts were made in that direction. And my last question is a very short question. I am wondering which is language that terrorists are using for their operations. Are they using English, Arabic? In general, how operates this network? Thank you.
The question of Azerbaijan and broader promotion of democracy, you're certainly right, I think, about the perception that the United States is often against democracy. And that perception is not unfounded in many parts of the world. The United States works with governments of Libya and Sudan and Saudi Arabia, and these are fundamentally undemocratic governments. I mean, there's no way you can dress them up to be anything but what they are. So the United States, of course, wants what most governments want, which is sometimes it wants to be on the side of the angels, and sometimes to get things done through a king or an autocrat. I don't claim any expertise at all on Azerbaijan. So whether there was a moment, or there still is a moment, to be supporting democracy more aggressive there, I don't know, and I would take your word for it, sir. But I would agree with your broader point, which is that when I said that we need to be supporting democracy where it's already happening on its own steam, it requires a certain degree of nimbleness. And to go back to Pakistan, which is a country I know a bit better, there to me was an example where, a year ago there wasn't really a powerful democratic movement in Pakistan, and then, for reasons of its own, it started to take off. And it was the courage of some members of the judiciary, it was political candidates stepping into the fray, and it began to take off. And there was a window. And maybe the window is still open. I actually think it's much smaller window than it was even 2 months ago. So you need that ability from a policy point of view to be nimble, which for a large lumbering bureaucracy in government where senior leaders have many things to do is quite hard. On languages, the answer is it depends. Certainly some of it is in, as you'd expect, some of it is in Arabic, some of it is in English, some of it is in Pashto. It depends what you're counting for the phenomena. If you count Lashkar-e-Taiba in Pakistan as part of this phenomena, then a lot of the language we're talking about is, Urdu and Pashto. If we're talking about kind of radicalized Muslims in Western Europe, some of it is Arabic because some of these are people directly from Arab lands, but some of it is English. A lot of the chat room is English. So there's a wide variety. What I'll add to it, though, is what makes it harder for the United States is not just that it's many languages, but it's often dialects or regions that are not at the capital. So in Pakistan, it's often not Urdu, but it's often Pashto. And that's, if you're a Pakistan specialist in the U.S. government, you learn Urdu. And that's not what you actually need for this. And there's no Pashtunistan that people train for. So you have a lot of languages that are not primary languages of the country, but are nevertheless tremendously important from a counterterrorism point of view.
Okay. Well, we'll take you, and then, you had a question, and we'll have to wrap it up, but why don't we take both of them together?
Jessica Lehman from Dedica DFI. My question regards the homegrown threat of, does the U.S. do better than perhaps other Western countries in reaching out to the Muslim community, or is it more the nature of the U.S. in terms of that embracing we are all immigrants and we have a multicultural society? And if you could comment on U.S. policies or lack thereof.
Thanks. Leonore Tamura with the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. My question to Dr. Byman is on Pakistan. If you could go into more detail about what you think should happen in Pakistan and the problem with the safe haven for al-Qaeda. Do you think the new elections will translate into Pakistan being more aggressive about it, or is it something that might happen over time, or is this really a tough issue where we won't get to the terrorists in this safe haven and we need to pursue other defenses? Thank you.
On the homegrown threat, I personally think it's much more the nature of U.S. society. There have been very commendable efforts to reach out to the Muslim community. And I will say that the Bush administration, more than any administration in U.S. history, has tried to reach out. And I think a lot of that is the nature of electoral politics in the United States, where Muslims are voting and more politically powerful than they've ever been. But part of it is also, I think, a genuine sense that this is a community that has been neglected that shouldn't be. But there are a couple problems with it. One is that there have been some actually rather hateful statements by some U.S. leaders, in particular some members of the U.S. evangelical community. And it's very, very hard to, on the one hand, say quite nice things, as President Bush himself has, at the same time be shaking hands with the leaders of these communities. And the joy of a world before globalization was you could talk out of both sides of your mouth, and you didn't get caught that often. Now you get caught. I mean, you have this picture of President Bush shaking hands with someone, and then the image of that person saying hateful things is on the split screen. But all that said, the American Muslim community, on average, is better educated and wealthier than the non-Muslim community in the United States. It's from many different countries, so it's not like England where there's a large concentration from one particular country. And so the American dream is working in many ways. And there have been efforts, by state and local officials to kind of reach out to these communities. But I actually think it's a good situation, and the hand that we've been dealt has been played reasonably well, not ideally, but reasonably well. On Pakistan, Pakistan is where good policies go to die. One joy of my position is I can make fun of any policy approach anyone else has on Pakistan, but in the end, president or a new administration still has to do something about it. I think the new elections will make the safe haven much worse for a couple of reasons. First of all, going after the safe haven is largely seen in Pakistan as doing the U.S. bidding, which is not something that is a label any politician wants. Add to that the military regime in particular is trying to court the various Islamist parties that have very close ties to some of the radicals. So their willingness to go after them hard is quite limited. And if the secular parties gain more advantage, many of them are quite hostile to the Islamist parties. The Boudreaux assassination, I think, solidified what already was quite a hostile stance. But their ability to force the military and the intelligence services to do what they want is open-ended. Will they want to pick this particular fight, or will they focus on other issues? In general, democracies tend to be a bit more chaotic and difficult as partners. And I think that's likely to be the case in Pakistan. But as I said, since I think the advantages of autocracy are shrinking, I'd rather work with the democratic side. But it's a lousy option, and in the near term at least, I think the safe haven's going to get worse rather than better.
Thank you, Dan. I think your new book, as well as your previous work, is really superb examples of how academically rigorous research can be translated and is compatible with sort of contemporary policy analysis and being policy relevant. And as we were discussing before the session began, the gap that Alexander George talked about between academia and the policy worlds, disciplinary trends are sort of been pushing the worlds apart, and I think your work is just a superb example of how the bridging can be done successfully. And so I commend you for your new book and your presentation today. Please join me in thanking Dan.